The triumph and tragedy of David. David could not mourn long for Saul and Jonathan, for his land was sorely troubled and in great need of him. When he had done with weeping and lamenting, he inquired of the Lord what he should do. "Go back to Judah," said the Lord. "Go to Hebron and dwell there." So David journeyed back to his own land, taking with him his several wives, all the men who had been with him during his years of exile, and all the people of their households. The men of Judah came to welcome him, and there in Hebron they anointed David king over the house of Judah. But to be king of Judah was not to be king of all Israel, and those who were left of the house of Saul were by no means ready to give up their claim. Abner, once captain of Saul's army, chose to support Saul's one surviving son as king, and succeeded in making him ruler over 11 tribes of Israel. Saul's son reigned for 2 years, but the house of Judah remained faithful to David. Now there was long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. Abner fought hard for Saul, and David's nephew Joab gathered forces to destroy the armies of Abner. David gradually grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. When at last both Abner and the son of Saul were dead, all the leaders of the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron. "Behold," they said, "we are your brothers. In time past, when Saul was king, it was you who led the armies of Israel and brought us victory. The Lord then said to you, 'You shall feed my people Israel, and you shall be a captain over Israel. Therefore make a league with us before the Lord, that you will rule us from this day on.'" David vowed before the Lord to rule with all his might and wisdom, and the elders of Israel anointed him that day as king over all 12 tribes of Israel. Thus was Israel once again a united nation. As king of all the land, David needed a great city for his stronghold. The fortified hill town of Jerusalem seemed ideal to him. It was occupied by the Jebusites, people of the land that had once been known as Canaan, and they boasted that their town was so strong that the blind and lame could hold it against any foe. But they were wrong. David drove them out and took their city easily, and from that time on Jerusalem was known as the City of David. The city grew in size and wealth, and David himself grew powerful and great. He took more wives and concubines, and he had many sons. His fame spread rapidly to many lands, and their kings sent gifts to him. Hiram, king of the Phoenician city of Tyre, sent gift-laden messengers to David, as well as cedar trees and carpenters and masons, and they built David a royal palace. David thanked the Lord for his good fortune, for he saw that the Lord had indeed established him as king of Israel, and that the Lord had exalted his kingdom, so that the children of Israel might be great upon the earth. But the Philistines were still strong in many of the cities of Israel, and when they heard that David had been anointed king of Israel, they determined to destroy him. They marched their mighty armies toward Jerusalem and spread across the valley of Rephaim, south of the city. David looked down at their vast forces and inquired of the Lord how he should meet this new threat. "Shall I march against the Philistines?" he asked. "Will you be with me and bring me victory?" "You shall not go out to meet them face to face," said the Lord. "Instead, you must go around behind them, so that they do not see you, and array your forces beneath the mulberry trees. And let it be that when you hear the wind blow through the tops of the mulberry trees, you will go into battle and attack them from the rear. For the sound among the trees will be a sign that the Lord is moving before you to destroy the Philistines." David did as the Lord commanded him. When he heard the wind sighing through the treetops, he launched a swift surprise attack that drove the Philistines out of the land of Israel and broke their power for many years to come. Now Israel truly was a nation worthy of respect, and Jerusalem was a capital fit not only for a king, but for the house of God. David, in his gratitude and triumph, decided to bring the ark of the Lord to the royal city. Therefore he built a small tabernacle to house it until such time as he could build the magnificent temple that he had begun to plan, and he gathered together all the chosen men of Israel to join in a triumphal procession to carry the ark to its new resting place. On that day he laid aside his kingly robes for the simple garments of a priest, and as the great procession wound toward the hills of Jerusalem, he danced joyfully before the Lord with all his might. Trumpets, harps, cornets, and cymbals sent their exultant noises to the skies. all the house of Israel shouted out their gladness and sang songs of praise to the Lord their God. And the priests of David set the ark down reverently in the simple tabernacle. "O come, let us sing unto the Lord," the joyous voices sang. "Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving, and make a joyful noise unto him with psalms." With renewed faith in God and the ark in their midst, the people of Israel prospered mightily under David's rule. The scattered tribes were now one people, and in their new strength they successfully drove off invading hordes of Ammonites and Syrians and Moabites until it was no longer necessary for David himself to lead them into battle. Joab, captain of the Israelite armies, was well equipped to handle the border skirmishes that still took place. David ruled long and wisely, and in his time Israel was great. Yet David was not wise in everything he did. One evening he rose from his bed and walked upon the flat roof of his palace. And from the roof he saw a very beautiful woman whom suddenly he loved. He inquired after her, and learned that her name was Bathsheba, and that she was the wife of one Uriah, a soldier in his own army. Now David did a very sinful thing. He commanded Joab to send Uriah into the forefront of the battle, so that he would be struck down and killed. And Joab did assign Uriah to the most dangerous part of the battlefield where fighting was at its hottest peak. Uriah fought valiantly, for he was a dedicated soldier, until he fell beneath an enemy sword and died there on the battlefield in the service of his king. When word came to him of Uriah's death, David married the widow of the man whose death he had so cruelly arranged, and soon Bathsheba had a child. But the Lord knew what David had done. In punishment to David, he let Bathsheba's first child sicken and die. David was grieved, but since his remorse for the terrible thing he had done was greater than his grief, the Lord gave him and Bathsheba another son, whom they named Solomon. David had many other sons by other wives, and among them he had one great favorite whom he dearly loved. His name was Absalom. In all Israel, there was none so praised for his manly beauty as this princely youth. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, he was perfect in every outward way. His own pride and joy was in the long flowing hair that he cut only once a year, when it was heavy on him and became a burden. David did not realize, however, that Absalom had dreams of being king, and that he was already making plans to win the people to his side, preparing chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him, so that Israel would take note of him and see his splendor. Thus displaying himself to be admired, Absalom made it a practice to rise early in the morning and go to the gates of the city, so that any man coming with a cause to lay before the king would see him first. Then the handsome prince would call out in a friendly manner and say, "Where do you come from, and what troubles you?" The man would answer and explain why he had come to the city of David seeking judgment to settle a claim. "Your claims are good and right," Absalom would say. "What a pity it is that there is no one appointed by the king to hear and help you. If only I were a judge in the land, then every man with suit or cause could come to me, and I would do him justice." His kind words and friendly manner had great effect on those who came to see the king. Not only did he always find their causes to be right and just, and express a warm desire to help, he also treated them with courtesy, so that when they wished to bow to him, he would restrain them gently, and instead take each man by the hand and graciously bestow a kiss. In this way did he treat all those he met on their way to David, and with his courtesy and kindness he won the hearts of the people of Israel. One day Absalom went to David and said, "Let me go, I pray you, to Hebron, to fulfill a vow which I made unto the Lord, for I did swear that I would serve the Lord in Hebron." "Go in peace," King David said, not knowing or suspecting that Absalom was using his vow as an excuse to leave Jerusalem and pursue his own plans for the kingship. Indeed, David knew nothing of what his son was doing. Absalom took 200 men with him from Jerusalem, innocent men who did not understand that he was making use of them. Upon his arrival in Hebron, Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall cry out, 'Absalom is king in Hebron.' For here in Hebron too Absalom had many friends, and he intended to gather his followers at this place and quickly build an army. Thus the conspiracy grew strong. The people turned increasingly toward the handsome, well-loved Absalom, and supporters flocked to his side in Hebron. Soon they would be ready to attack the city of Jerusalem and force David from his throne. Then, just before Absalom's preparations were complete, a messenger hurried to David saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom your son." And the man told him what was happening at Hebron. David's distress was great. His favorite son, his Absalom. To war against him was unthinkable. To let him succeed in what he was doing would be sheer disaster. Scarcely knowing what to do, David decided that there was no way to save the city of Jerusalem from ruin but to leave it with all haste. "Arise," he told the faithful followers who were still with him. "Let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Quickly get ready to depart, or he will overtake us here and destroy the city." So the king left the city with his household and his men, leaving only the priests to guard the ark of the Lord, and a handful of women to keep the royal house in order. If the Lord was with him, David thought, he would return to the city of Jerusalem. And if not, it was better that the ark should remain in the tabernacle. David and all the people with him crossed over the brook Kidron and gathered together in the wilderness. Then David climbed slowly up the Mount of Olives, weeping bitterly for the favored son who had turned against him and for the people who had conspired with Absalom for his downfall. Meanwhile, Absalom with his forces entered into the city of Jerusalem, only to find that it was almost empty. With his counselors he made cunning plans to seek out David and attack him. Now David, saddened though he was still a king and still a fighting man. And although he did not want to harm his son, he knew that he must stop this revolt or his country would suffer badly. Therefore, when he had composed himself, he led his forces by night over the river Jordan to the town of Mahanaim, where the people treated him with kindness and offered full support. There at Mahanaim he prepared for battle, dividing his army into 3 divisions, with an experienced captain over each. One division came under the leadership of Joab, one under Abishai, and one under a man named Ittai, who had volunteered his services to David after seeing the king's need. And David said to his people as they gathered in their strength, "I will go forth with you and lead you." But the people answered, "No, you shall not go into battle. If we flee, it will not matter, nor will it matter if half of us should die. But you are worth 10,000 of us, so you shall not either flee or die. Therefore stay here in the city and help us from this place." "I will do whatever seems best to you," said David humbly. And he stationed himself beside the city gates. All the people came out by their hundreds and their thousands to hear his words and do battle for him. As Joab and Abishai passed by with their divisions, he commanded them, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." And all the people heard him when he gave these orders to his captains. So the forces of David went out into the field against those who followed Absalom, and David waited at the gates of Mahanaim for news. The battle took place on the wooded slopes of Mount Ephraim, and in the valley below, a vast stretch of forest land that was a tangle of great oaks and heavy undergrowth. And Absalom in his great confidence went forth ahead of his untried band of men. The 2 forces clashed head-on, and one was far superior to the other. David's 3 divisions of loyal and experienced fighting men quickly got the upper hand over the poorly led and ill-advised army of his son Absalom. The battle spread through the vast woods and over the face of the country. Thousands of men fell by the sword, and thousands more ran panic-stricken through the confusion of trees and vines to lose themselves in the great forest. There was a great and terrible slaughter that day of 20,000 men. And the people of Israel, the followers of Absalom, fell in great numbers before the loyal followers of David. Absalom, in his vanity, had not thought to cut his richly flowing hair before going into battle. Here and there he galloped on his mule, rallying his forces and demanding victory. And as his men scattered in retreat, he rode behind them, searching desperately for a way out of the dark woods. On all sides he saw the soldiers of his father David, and he whipped his mule to greater speed so that he might ride between them. His long hair blew high as he rode, and his frightened mule darted beneath the trees and ran under the low-hanging, clutching boughs of a great oak. And suddenly Absalom was swinging between heaven and earth. The lovely long hair of which he was so proud caught on the branches of the tree. The mule galloped desperately away from under him and left him hanging there. One of David's soldiers saw him dangling in midair. Remembering his king's words, he did not harm the prince, but hurried to his captain Joab. "Behold," he said, "I saw Absalom hanging from an oak by his long hair." "You saw him helpless, and you did not strike him to the ground," Joab said roughly. "I would have rewarded you with 10 shekels of silver if you had killed the traitor Absalom." "I would not put forth my hand against the king's son for 1,000 shekels of silver," said the man. "For we all heard the king charging you and Abishai and Ittai not to touch the young man Absalom. You yourself would have been the first to blame me if I had." "I cannot waste time with such as you," said Joab, for he had no such scruples. With 3 darts in his hand, he strode off to the oak from which Absalom hung, still alive and struggling painfully to free himself. And Joab thrust the 3 darts into the heart of David's son. Then he blew his trumpet, and his men returned from pursuing the fleeing forces of Absalom. They took his limp body from the tree and cast it into a deep pit in the forest. And then they filled in the crude grave and built a great mound of stones above it. Now all was over for the followers of Absalom. There was nothing left for them to fight for, nothing left for them to do but run and hide. David still waited at the city gates of Mahanaim for word of the battle. A watchman on the roof above him lifted up his eyes and saw a man in the distance running toward the city. The watchman called out and told the king. "If he is alone," said David, "he must be bringing news," and he waited anxiously. Then the watchman saw another man running. "Behold, another man running alone," he called out. "But the one in front looks like Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok the priest." "If it is Ahimaaz, he is a good man," said the king. "Therefore he must be coming with good tidings." Ahimaaz called out as he drew nearer, "All is well, the victory is ours." And he fell down to the earth upon his face before the king, saying, "Blessed be the Lord God, who has delivered into your hands the men who rebelled against my lord the king." The king had but one question. "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz knew the answer, but he loved his king and could not bring himself to tell David what had happened. So he turned his head away from the king's gaze, and he lied. "When Joab sent me on my way," he said, "there was great noise and tumult, but I knew not what it was." The second runner came to a stop in front of David. "Stand aside," the king told Ahimaaz, and turned his attention to the second messenger. Ahimaaz waited with a sinking heart as the man Cushai gave his message. "News, my lord the king," Cushai began. "For the Lord has given you vengeance this day against all those who rose against you." Again the king had but one question. "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Cushai hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Finally he said, "May the enemies of my lord the king, and all that rise against you to do you harm, be as that young man is now." Then David knew that Absalom was dead, and instead of rejoicing in his victory, he mourned bitterly for his lost son. The rebellion had been broken, and David needed only to return to Jerusalem and reunite his people, for now they needed him more than ever before. But for days he covered his face and wept and cried out, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom! Would God I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." And the great victory of that day was turned into mourning for all the people, for they heard how David grieved and cried out in his anguish, "O Absalom, my son, my son."
The wisdom of Solomon. Now King David was old, and his days were drawing to a close. In spite of occasional rebellion, he had succeeded in welding his kingdom together so that it was strong and worthy of respect. His life had been full. Apart from his sorrow over Absalom, he had but one regret, and that was the Lord's refusal to allow him to build a temple for the ark. David's hands, the Lord had told him, were too blood-stained by war. Someday his son would build the holy house instead. He had many sons, but his wife Bathsheba had made him swear that Solomon would be king. Therefore, when David felt the day of his death to be drawing near, he saw to it that Solomon was anointed king, and he told all Israel what the Lord their God demanded of a king. Said David, "The God who is the rock of Israel spoke to me and said, 'He that rules over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God. And he shall be as the light of the morning, when the sun rises, a morning without clouds. He shall be as pure as the tender grass that springs out of the earth in the clear sunshine after rain.' Let Solomon be such a king, for then the Lord will be a tower of salvation and will be merciful to his anointed." Then David called Solomon to him and spoke to him for one last time. "I go the way of all the earth," he said. "Be strong, therefore, and show yourself a man. Keep the commandments of the Lord your God, and walk according to his ways. Obey his statutes and his judgments and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in everything you do. Then will the Lord fulfill the promise which he made to me, saying, 'If your children take heed of their ways and walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul, then shall there always be a man among them on the throne of Israel.' Moreover, you know who has been faithful to me and who has not. Do therefore according to your wisdom. Show kindness to those who have shown kindness to me, and do what you will to those who have done evil." So David slept with his fathers, and was buried in the city of David. He had reigned over Israel for 40 years, 7 years in Hebron, and 33 years in the city of Jerusalem. Now Solomon sat upon the throne of David his father, and under him a mighty kingdom was established. In accordance with his father's wishes, he dealt out swift, stern punishment to those who had wronged David in his lifetime, and also to those who had threatened his own throne at the beginning of his reign. But he dealt kindly with those who were loyal to the house of David. To forestall war between Israel and the neighboring countries, he made alliances with foreign kings, the first and most powerful of whom was Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter, making her the first of his many alien wives, and he brought her to live in the city of David. Then he devoted himself to securing his city and his kingdom. With the vast wealth inherited from David, he began to strengthen the great wall around Jerusalem, to build storehouses for storing grain against leaner times, and to build both a fine palace for himself and a temple for the Lord. But until the house of the Lord was completed, the people of Israel worshipped and made their sacrifices on the tops of hills. King Solomon loved the Lord and walked in the ways of David his father, and he too sacrificed and burnt incense in high places to the God of Israel. Often he would go to Gibeon to make his sacrifices there, for Gibeon was a great high place, and there he offered 1,000 offerings upon the altar of the Lord. In Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said to Solomon, "Ask of me what you will, that I may give it to you." Solomon was humble of heart, and he knew that he needed much wisdom and heavenly guidance to rule his kingdom well. "You showed great mercy to my father David, because he walked before you in truth and righteousness," he said. "And in your kindness you gave to him a son to sit upon his throne, as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, I your servant am king instead of David, but I am like a little child and know not how to rule. I am in the midst of your chosen people, a great people, who cannot be counted, for they are so many, and it is for me to lead them. Give to me, therefore, an understanding heart to judge your people, so that I may know the difference between good and bad. For without God's wisdom, who would be able to judge so great a people as yours?" It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. He said to Solomon, "Because you have asked for this, and not for long life or riches for yourself, nor for the lives of your enemies, but for understanding to make wise judgments, I will give you what you ask. I give you this day a wise and understanding heart, so that there shall never have been a man like you before you, nor shall there ever be in time to come. And I also give to you that which you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any one among the kings like you in all your days. And if you will walk in my ways, and keep my laws and commandments, as your father David did, I will also lengthen your days." Then Solomon awoke, and knew he had been dreaming. Yet he was sure that the Lord had indeed spoken to him in his dream. He therefore went back to his city of Jerusalem to make offerings before the ark of the Lord, and he called all his servants and attendants to a great feast of thanksgiving. It was apparent before long that the prayer of his dream had been answered, for there came to him one day 2 women who stood before the king with a case for him to judge. With them they had brought a tiny baby. "Oh, my lord," the first woman said, "this woman and I live in the same house, and the child was born to me while she was in the house. It happened then that on the 3rd day after I had my child, this woman also bore a son. Only we 2 were in the house. There was no one with us but the babies. And this woman's child died in the night, and she arose quietly at midnight and took my boy from beside me while I slept. Then she laid him on her bosom and put her dead child in my arms. When I rose from my bed in the morning to nurse my child, I saw that the child I held against me was no longer living. When I looked at him in the light of dawn, I found that it was not my son that I was holding in my arms." "It is not so," the woman said. "The living is my son, and the dead is yours." "No, the dead is your son," the first woman said again. "The living child is mine." Thus they spoke in anger to each other before King Solomon. The king listened closely, and then he said, "The one says, 'This is my son that lives, and yours is the dead.' And the other says, 'No, but your son is dead, and my son is the living. Therefore let us see which of you is telling the truth.'" He turned to his guards. "Bring me a sword," he ordered. They brought it to him. "Now," said Solomon, "divide the living child in 2, and give half to one woman and half to the other." "Oh, my lord, no!" cried the woman whose son it truly was, for her heart yearned for her son and she wanted him to live. "Give her the living child, and do not kill it." The other woman said only, "Let it be neither mine nor yours. Let it be divided." But Solomon had no intention of doing so cruel a thing. He had been testing both women, and one of them had failed. "Give the child to the woman who does not want the child divided," he ordered his men. "By no means harm it. She is his mother, for she would rather give him up than allow him to be hurt." All Israel heard of the judgment which the king had made, and their respect for Solomon was great. They saw that the wisdom of God was indeed in him, so that he made judgments that were fair and wise. Solomon ruled well over Israel, and he had peace on all sides round about him. The people of his kingdom lived in safety, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, from Dan even to Beersheba, for all the days of the son of David. God gave him much wisdom and understanding and largeness of heart, as much as the sand that is on the seashore. His wisdom excelled that of all the sages of the East and all the people of Egypt. He was wiser than all men, and his fame spread to all the nations round about the land of Israel. It seemed that there was nothing that Solomon did not know, nothing that he could not explain for everyone to understand. He spoke learnedly of trees and herbs, of beasts and birds, of creeping things, and of the fishes of the sea. And there were some who said that he could even speak the language of the beasts, and talk to them in their own tongues. Like his father David, he made songs about things of beauty under the Lord's sky, and he spoke 3,000 proverbs to guide his people in the ways of righteousness. And these are some of the 3,000 sayings. Hatred stirreth up strifes, but love covereth all transgressions. A righteous man regardeth the life of his beasts, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. The way of the foolish is right in his own eyes, but he that is wise hearketh unto counsel. A soft answer turneth away wrath, but a grievous word stirreth up anger. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city. A merry heart is good medicine, but a broken spirit drieth up the bones. Even a child maketh himself known by his doings, whether his work be pure, and whether it be right. A good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver and gold. And people of all lands came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, even the kings of the earth who had heard of his great knowledge. Hiram, king of Tyre, in the land of the Phoenicians, sent goodwill messages to Solomon, for Hiram had been David's friend. Solomon received his greetings gladly, and sent back his own messengers, saying, You know how my father David could not build a house unto the Lord his God, because of the wars which were about him on every side. But now the Lord has given me peace, so that there is neither enemy nor evil happening to prevent this work, and I intend to build a temple to the Lord my God. Therefore I beg you, command your servants to cut me cedar trees out of Lebanon. My servants shall work with yours, and I will pay your men for help, for you know that there is none among us with the skill of your people. When Hiram heard these words from the messengers of Israel, he rejoiced greatly and said, Blessed be your Lord this day, who has given David a wise son over this great people. So he sent to Solomon all the cedar trees and timbers of fir that the king of Israel wanted for the temple, and skilled workmen to help with the building of it. Solomon, in exchange, sent great quantities of wheat and oil for Hiram's household, and the two kings made a pact together that they would always live in peace. It was in the 480th year after the children of Israel escaped from the bondage of Egypt, and in the 4th year of Solomon's reign, that he began to build the house of the Lord. And he commanded first that his servants bring great stones, cut stones, and costly ones, to lay the foundation of the temple. In accordance with his wishes, the stone was made ready before it was brought into the city of Jerusalem, so that there would be no sound of axe nor hammer nor any tool of iron in the Lord's house while it was being built. Now, though David had not been permitted to build the Lord's house himself, God had told him that his son would build it in his time. Therefore David had prepared many rich things and materials for the temple, and he had told his son Solomon, Behold, I have prepared for the house of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold, and 100,000 talents of silver, and brass and iron so abundant that it cannot be weighed. Timber also and stone I have prepared, and you may add to it. Here also is pure gold for the candlesticks and bowls and basins, as well as onyx and other precious stones of many colors, and marble in abundance. Then David had given to Solomon the pattern for the main building, the porch, and all the rooms, and for the inner holy chamber where the ark of the covenant would rest. Therefore Solomon sent also for the riches stored by David, and proceeded to build the Lord's house according to the pattern laid out by his father. The outside walls were gigantic blocks of stone. The walls, floors, and ceilings of the temple were solid boards of cedar, and when the floors had been laid, Solomon covered them with planks of fir. And the cedar of the house within was carved with knobs and open flowers. No stone showed inside, for all was cedar, and much of it was carved into lovely intricate shapes. Then Solomon covered the whole house and the whole altar in the Holy of Holies with the purest gold. And he carved all the walls of the house with figures of cherubim and palm trees and flowers in bloom, and covered them all with gold. Solomon spent 7 years in building the house of the Lord, and when it was done there was nothing like it for magnificence in all the earth. He brought in all the things that David had gathered and dedicated to the Lord, the gold and silver, the vessels and the candlesticks, the precious stones, and he put them among the treasures in the Lord's house. So ended his work. Then he called together all the elders of Israel and the heads of the tribes, so that they might bring the ark of the Lord into the beautiful new temple and give thanks unto the Lord for his many blessings. With their hearts full of praise and gratitude to God, the priests brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its new resting place. There was nothing in it but the 2 tablets of stone which Moses had put into it at Sinai, but it was the most glorious and holy thing in Solomon's temple. And when the ark had been put in place, the glory of God filled the house of the Lord with so bright a light that the priests could not look upon it. Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the people of Israel, and stretched his hands toward the heavens. "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel," he said prayerfully. "I have built you a house to live in, a settled place for you to abide in forever, and a place where the ark of the covenant may rest eternally. Blessed be the Lord who has given rest unto his people Israel as he promised. O God of Israel, hear your servant and your people when they pray toward this place, and may they trust and honor the Lord all the days that they live in the land." Then Solomon blessed all the congregation of Israel, and held a great feast of thanksgiving for all his people. When all the feasting was over, and the people had departed to their homes, the Lord again appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, as he had done at Gibeon. "I have hallowed this house that you have made," said the God of Israel, "and I shall be within it as long as your heart is with me. If you walk in my ways as your father David walked, being upright and keeping always my commandments and my laws, I will bless you and your children forever with the throne of Israel. But if you or your children turn away from following me and go to worship other gods, then I will leave this house that you have built. I will cut Israel out of the land which I have given them, and much sorrow shall fall upon the people." Solomon would have done well to heed these words of the Lord, for in them was not only a blessing, but a warning.